I'm going to use consistently Y for income because, I don't know, when you first studied economics 101, income was always Y, so it's Y here as well. And so I've got the slightly counterintuitive thing that Y, income, then gets transformed into something called X, which is, if you like, disposable. It's post-intervention income. You could think of it as income available for consumption. We don't want to get too much into the detail of that so that we get a little bit lost and bogged down. So we move on from there to connect this function tau, talking about the relationship between two distributions. So you've got the Y distribution, what would be notionally there if there was no government intervention, and the X distribution. I need to say a little bit more about that because many of you will be thinking, oh, well, that's a little bit of a cheat talking about it in those terms, but we'll get to that in a second. And straight away, we notice that there are multiple concepts of progression, so that, let me just list a few of these, and this is the reference I made to the earlier literature on tax progression, going back as far as Musgrave and Thin, right back to 1948. And if we just allow ourselves to do a little bit of maths in our heads, we could think of average rate progression. How does the average income tax, 12Y divided by Y, how does that change with income? We could think about marginal rate progression. I think all this is just lifted from the Musgrave and Thin paper. An interesting alternative concept is to look at the rate at which tax liability changes, and a concept that became rather more to the fore in the 1970s literature, this idea of residual income progression. In other words, looking directly at the elasticity of your disposable income or your post-intervention income with respect to income itself. So a variety of alternative concepts which Musgrave and Thin very kindly laid out for us all those years ago. And what we'll find is that it's this last one that is of particular interest for much of what we want to do. In fact, it's really the first and the last turn out to be particularly interesting. So, I mentioned that there were various approaches that we might want to adopt here. And just to remind you, these are the three that we're going to look at. And I'd like to discuss intuition first of all. Intuition's quite nice. As I mentioned, the problem is everyone has his or her own intuition, whether we're talking to politicians, whether we're talking to academics indeed. So let's just see how it's been done. So the pragmatic approach says, well, let's just look at the facts. You know, we've got, I know, some official statisticians amongst us here, and that's great. So we just turn over to them and say, well, tell us about income distribution in UK, in Spain, Portugal, wherever, and tell us about how the tax system, the tax benefit system gets involved in the story of income distribution, just nothing more than that. So a little bit of notation here. I'll use bold Y to indicate the ordered income distribution. So Y sub 1 in brackets means that we've already prearranged the distribution in ascending order of incomes. We need little red flag alert. I'll just wave my left arm when you need to be careful. We need to be a little bit careful about this, as we will see as we go along. So along with that, we can also say, well, we check out the tax code, and we have to make various assumptions about whether the tax code is really effective or whether it's some kind of fiction and people just pay what they want to pay. But let's assume that the tax code is effective, and so corresponding to those same individuals, let's say we've arranged the tax, I beg your pardon, we hope that these correspond to the same individuals so that taxes actually increase with income. That's something that we're going to look at here. But once again, we could arrange tax receipts in ascending order of taxes there as well. So the same notation, brackets 1, brackets 2, and so on. And it may be that the ordering in the first line is the same as the ordering in the second line. We'll get to that as well. And likewise, we could define the distribution of post-tax income in the same way as well. And some of you are thinking, I wonder what happens if when we line up the Y distribution in terms of individuals, 1, 2, 3, 4, around like this, it turns out that when we look at the X distribution, it's not 1, 2, 3, but 1, 2, 3. You know, there could be that. We'll get to that a little bit later on. And it's also convenient if I use capital letters to indicate aggregates. So if we're lining up everybody in terms of the order of pre-tax income, little y sub I is the income for the ith person in order. Big Y sub I is the accumulation of incomes up to the ith person. Same concept with the taxes, big T. Same concept with the after intervention income, big X. And so from that we just get the share of incomes, the share of taxes, the share of income after intervention, this kind of thing. And again, whenever I say taxes, it's a shorthand for saying taxes and benefits. So these little t concepts can be positive or negative, depending on the intervention that we're looking at here. So, I really don't need to put this slide in, but this is just for completeness. We're going to make extensive use of Lorentz curves as a descriptive tool and also as an analytical tool. And what you find in the literature is that, yes, people look at the Lorentz curve of Y, the Lorentz curve of X, and we'll see a nice example of that in a minute. But also in the literature, you find people looking at plotting on a Lorentz diagram. This kind of thing, we'll see in a moment, where we take the pre-tax incomes for the Lorentz curve, and we can also look, and we see this in the literature, the Lorentz curve of the burden of taxes. So the second bullet point there, pre-tax Lorentz curves for income, well, this is a kind of, how shall I put it, we'd say in British English, you know, this is the bread and butter of a subject of distribution analysis. The last of those bullet points I've already put up there is a little bit different, because then you're applying the same analytical tool, Lorentz curves, to tax burdens, and we might want to compare the second bullet point with the final bullet point to look at pre-tax and post-tax income. And these concepts then give rise to a number of definitions of tax progression. And I didn't want to burden you with lots and lots of references. Incidentally, if afterwards the organizers are going to share the presentation, all of these references are at the end of the presentation, so you don't have to say, where is this Formby et al. Paper or whatever. Okay, so what you can imagine is a number of these concepts, and if you look at the Lorentz curves of, here we've got the share of income measured along the horizontal axis and the share of tax, and so for a simple tax which involves an exemption level and a constant marginal rate of tax, you'd get a schedule that looks like that. And some of the contributors to the literature said, well, look, just as we use the Lorentz curve to give us our first goal at inequality, if you've taught an applied economics course which has got a little bit of inequality in it, you've probably drawn a Lorentz curve and say, hey, look at the distance between the line of equality and the actual distribution. There's our first goal at an inequality measure, the Gini coefficient, once we normalized it and so on. So you find in the tax progression literature, you say, well, you know what we perhaps want to do is to compare the actual distribution of tax burden with what it would be if it was just a simple proportional tax, and you get something similar to that. So there's the intuition, and it seems to me a reasonable sort of intuition. So that's sort of motivating diagram number one. Now, motivating diagram number two, I want to talk to you, to those of you here whose everyday bread and butter is carefully analyzing numbers, the statisticians amongst you. And I've used an example from the UK, but I know for a fact that there are equivalent examples that I could have taken from many other countries. And when I teach at the LSE, I often get students that say, oh, in my country there was a similar kind of thing here, in Brazil or wherever it is, in the US and so on. But the Office for National Statistics is a particularly nice example here. And they've been doing what I'm about to show you here. They've been doing this for a long time, so that in effect we could get a simple illustration of the key concepts that we like to use. So they produce 5 regular data every year on 5 income concepts and the distribution of these concepts. And the broad brush by decile groups is just available online, and you can get, obviously you can get the macro data as well, but this is just for illustration purposes. So here are the 5 concepts set out in what they think, what the national statisticians think is a logical order. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best order. So we start with number 1, which is the original income. So this is the rather imperfect, I was going to say Garden of Eden, but you know what I mean. It's this, before anybody gets involved, before the government comes along and starts doing anything. So there's market income, there's private pensions and stuff like that. But of course, the ONS sets out the definition really very, very carefully. And it's a fiction, because obviously there are some people who have 0 original income according to this definition if they're relying, for example, entirely on state retirement pensions or something like that. But anyway, it's a useful concept, bearing in mind that some of those YIs in the Y sub I in the ONS definition will be 0. So you step from there and you say, well, to original income, we want to consider it's a plus term that we're putting in here. We include also cash benefits. So, for example, state retirement pension, unemployment benefit paid by the state, this kind of thing. As we'll see, that's a pretty important component, not only for the UK, but I think for most European countries. From gross income, that's step 2, with definition 2, we take our next step. So from 1 to 2 was the first step, 2 to 3 is the second step of redistribution, where we deduct income taxes and other taxes that are counted as direct taxes. In the UK, just to explain the terminology here, we maintain this fiction, I don't know whether it's done also in Spain or Portugal, that there is a difference between income taxes, which are collected by one agency, and national insurance contributions, which are not voluntary. I mean, they're compulsory in the same way that income tax is compulsory, but it's just a different label. But we put them all in together. Just to give you a little idea, if you're not familiar with the British system, we also have a kind of local taxation called council tax, which is not really quite the same thing at all. It's a tax on a form of wealth. I'll just give you a little bit of background there because it can seem a bit strange. Well, lots of things about the UK seem a bit strange nowadays, but this strangeness goes back many years. And it is what led to the downfall of Mrs. Thatcher, if you are interested in history there. Because for a long time in the UK, local authorities, for cities, for individual regions were funded by a thing known as the rates, in other words, some evaluation of the worth of property that was occupied, whether it was private property or own house or businesses, this kind of thing. And so Mrs. Thatcher wanted to, didn't like this idea of this form of taxation because it fell rather heavily on people who tended to vote for the Conservative Party, widowed women who were living in houses that were too big for them would have to pay a high amount of tax, and so she then she wanted to switch to a thing called, what they wanted to call community charge, and everybody else called a poll tax. This is one of the few times that Britain has rioted. The riots started in Scotland because that's where they first introduced. I mean, this is all history there. But after that, Mrs. Thatcher goes out. Another slightly more rational Conservative leader came in, John Major, and thought, well, we have to do something about this. And so they developed this thing called the council tax, which is it's a wonderful compromise, sort of British compromise between the previous system of the rates and then this idea of just a lump sum for everybody. So that it's just based on the kind of house that you live in. And I swear to you this is true. So there are these bands of council tax, I think it's A through to H. And how do they determine which band you'd be in? They literally had, I don't know what the right term to use for you would be here, they had what we would call estate agents, realtors, drive around the town and say, oh, well, that's a B, that's a G, that's, And so this is, I mean, it's quite important, but it's not very much studied, a form of direct tax. Okay, so sorry for the slight detour there on item number 3. Item number 4 then says, well, no good just looking at direct tax, so we should take into account indirect taxes, principally value-added tax, Évora, whatever you want to call it, but also excise duties on alcohol, tobacco, stuff like that. And then we need to take into account what the government is doing with this money that it takes in, and it also, apart from step number 1, which involved cash benefits, there are also non-cash benefits. So to the extent, and this would apply to any country, the extent that the state is involved, for example, in providing or subsidizing education services, health services, this kind of thing. Some of these things can be attributed to individuals or imputed to individuals, and so there's the non-cash benefit element to bring us up to what's final income, so that we've got these five different income definitions with 4 steps connecting them all from original income to final income. And so here we have the rents curve for those things, so that the red curve that's furthest away from the line of perfect equality is the original income, and then down at the dotted line that's closest to the line of perfect equality is final income. And if your eyes are sharp, you can see that the Lorentz curve, as you go from step to step to step, doesn't quite always go in the direction that you might think. So I'll just give you a moment or two to form your own conclusion about that diagram or that chart, and we'll come back to it a little bit later on if we may. Okay, so very often when we talk about the connections between the tax benefit system and between inequality, we just say, well, look, here are the Lorentz curves. What more is there to say? There are a few difficulties. Let me just briefly mention them. And some of them we're going to look firmly in the face and then we'll just move on and ignore them. But let me list in no particular order the key points here. So that one of the difficulties with the diagram we've got there is that inevitably, particularly with the last step, these income changes that just come from imputation. So you think, well, the government spends directly or indirectly a lot on education, and so the statisticians at the Office for National Statistics say, well, that can only benefit families who have children, all right? So we can impute some of that spending on education to such families. May or may not be a good assumption. Now, something which we'll touch on towards the end of the talk, it is often the case that when you move from the sort of academic abstraction in our ivory tower to realistic tax policies, people get moved around in such a way you think, well, you know, he was number one and at the bottom of the distribution on the Y distribution, and, you know, the person over there was number 5. And look what happens with this weird tax system. Weird has big quotation marks. Now he's number 15, he's number 1, or something like that. And you think, well, I think the mistake here is to assume that either this can never happen because surely in a sensible tax system you would never swap people around. That's a bad assumption. Or to assume that it's always happening all the time. Again, that's another bad assumption. And it's not necessarily a mistake. Typically, what happens is that, as I've just discussed, the interventions will be a number of layers of intervention. And it's almost inevitable that sometimes this will happen, depending on the level of disaggregation that you want to do. The problem for analytical discussions that if you just want to use Lorentz curves, you suddenly think, if we were to rely on the kind of analysis that we did with our Lorentz curves, and now instead of the subscript being little round brackets 1, round brackets 2, and so on, we've got these square brackets which says, well, we're looking at the distribution of after intervention income X's, but we're doing this, lining people up in order of pre-tax distribution, and you're going to get a messy concept which is no longer convex. We've no longer got very simple ways of interpreting those curves. I mean, there's a whole literature on this, so-called concentration curves. Third difficulty, which I'm going to say hi to this difficulty and then ignore it, is that we're only looking at mechanical effects here. So if, for example, we had something like the UK figures, which I've taken from, I think, 2021, and we said, now the governing party goes completely crazy and abolishes all forms of tax, saying this is going to incentivize people. Well, clearly, that original income distribution isn't going to stay exactly where it was. There is going to be some effect of major changes in the tax system on individual incomes. So in this discussion that we've got here, I'm not going to talk about agent responses to changes in taxation and so on, except just tangentially about that. But I think the main thing I would like to discuss here is that although we've got some nice illustrations in the literature, for example, the contributions of Kakwani and Suits and others that I mentioned earlier on. And we've got some nice examples from in the UK, from the Office for National Statistics, probably similar kinds of things in most European countries. Is this because they're called with intuition, is it the right way to deal with tax progression? So why don't we move on with that topic there to look at an analytical approach to the subject. So in the literature, people have had various attempts at doing this. I'll give you one rather nice one that I have often found appeals to students. And we make the following assumptions, where social welfare, thinking of interpreting everything in terms of social welfare, just depends on after-tax income. And we make the standard assumptions about social welfare so that it satisfies monotonicity, one person's better off, other things being equal, up goes social welfare, and the sometimes known as the Pico-Dalton condition or the transfer principle, so that richer to poorer, to a richer from a poorer person is going to reduce welfare. And we know the standard result on this, that we've got a nice relationship between those Lorenz curves we were looking at and social welfare. And so all of this is well known to us. Now, in the 1970s, after Tony Atkinson's seminal contribution, there was a number of nice contributions which also tie this in with tax. I think the one that I really like is this one by Ulf Jakobsen. And what I'm going to say now makes the assumption we're not going to deal with re-rankings just yet, so we assume that the tax benefit system doesn't move people around in terms of their ordering in society. And Jakobsen said, well, a concept that's really interesting to look at here, when we have these four different definitions of progression, is, well, why don't we look at the relationship between original income, pre-tax income, while pre-intervention income, Y, and post-intervention income, X, and look at that elasticity. And he pointed out that if you are comparing two different tax systems, TOR 1 and TOR 2, then what you really need to look at was these elasticities, where eta is defined as that elasticity of residual progression. And you would get a nice relationship between the distribution of post-intervention income from system 1 and system 2, a nice Lorenz ordering, just simply based on those elasticities, which is fairly easy to show. And some people will say, well, it's a little bit abstruse, because if you're talking about progressivity at each individual point in the distribution or progression overall, intuition doesn't lead you immediately to talk about residual progression rather than some other concept. So we can at least make a first step in connecting what we do in income distribution analysis with what happens when we analyze the progression or the tax progression overall. So, what we also see is that if we're looking just at proportional changes in everybody's incomes, then you're going to get that if the elasticity is constant for Y. Now, so we move on from the Nordic countries to the tough guy Germans. So Eichhorn and his contributors, famous for producing some very, very neat results, which you have to stop and think about very carefully and realize that it's actually pretty fundamental. So in the 1980s, focused on this, which I think is, well, they didn't put it quite this way, but I think this is the best way of interpreting what they did. They said, well, let's look at three propositions which you could put in a language that an intelligent politician could understand. Yeah, intelligent politician, okay, fine. An intelligent politician or an intelligent tax administrator would understand. So let's suppose that the average tax rate, this is proposition one, the average tax rate never decreases with income. Proposition number two, disposable income never decreases with original income. And proposition number three is just simply looking at the inequality of X and the inequality of Y. So there are three propositions, each of which I think we could put in a plain language thing to somebody who doesn't like mathematics, who knows nothing about economics. They say, yeah, at least understand those three propositions. And here's the result, that what Eichhorn and others showed, that if you've got proposition 1 and 2 together, they hold if and only if proposition number 3 holds. And you can strengthen that to situations where you want to say, well, the average tax rate is strictly increasing rather than just never decreases. So you can tweak that a little bit to, again, put it in language that people could readily understand. So that, I think, is fundamental to a lot of the understanding of the way tax progression and the welfare interpretation of Lorenz curves, this kind of thing, works. We should just move on from that a little bit, because we often make this fiction that we compare income distributions, somehow we're miraculously able to keep total income constant, and that's not necessarily appropriate. So we might want to just look at the implied assumption there is that suppose we assume that inequality remains unchanged if everybody's incomes change in the same proportion. And some people who've just not really got into the subject just automatically assume that. And the reason they assume it is the second of those little bullet points. They say, well, yeah, we don't want to be thrown just by what might happen, which would be, for example, if there was inflation, you've got the situation, well, in the UK now, there's a fairly high rate of inflation. We're not up to Argentina standards or somewhere like that, but we don't want this kind of money illusion just changing things. But if we just focus on that for saying, well, we want this proportionality assumption, we'd be missing an important thing, because we'd be missing the point that maybe our inequality judgments or the inequality comparisons would need to be looked at again if we were considering a country maybe that had undergone rapid economic development. So real incomes in the final year are much higher than real incomes in the initial year. Should we still have this kind of judgment about income distribution changes? So that what we really want to do is look at some kind of ISO inequality map. And we want to consider, well, how would that inequality map be adapted for different levels of income? And I'm sure some of us here will know all about this, but I'll just mention it for completeness, because although I'm going to continue to use Lorenz curves and things like that, we could at least consider what we might want to do other than that. So the standard is to say, well, when we move from one income level to another, we would just consider on our map a kind of proportionate expansion, and we get this reflected in so-called relative inequality indices, such as the regular Gini coefficient, such as the Atkinson class of inequality indices, or the generalized entropy class, which we'll come to in a second. So that if we just rescaled all incomes by the same factor, inequality is left unaltered. We could instead look at the contours being adjusted by, in the formal term, simple translation. So we moving everybody up 10 euros or $10 or 10 sterling, whatever it is, leaves inequality unchanged. This is the kind of approach that was originally developed, well, was certainly developed by Serge Christophe Colm, or we could adopt some kind of intermediate position, as I'm sure you're aware of. So let's just to remind ourselves of what can be done, and just what is interesting to know is that this can also be built into our analysis of tax progression. So to fix ideas, I mean, supposing you say, well, we've got country A and country B, so it's Austria and Belgium, and let's suppose that Austria is richer than Belgium. So the question we want to ask ourselves is, well, if each of those countries gets a change in the income distribution, what change would leave the judgment about inequality unaltered? So same income growth, same absolute changes for everyone in Austria, everyone in Belgium. And what happens to our computation of tax progression and welfare comparisons, because Eichhorn and others focused entirely on the case where we've got proportional changes. And the nice thing is, the nice genius from Bordeaux, Patrick Moyes, showed that if you adapted to the case of absolute changes in income, you can adapt the results of Eichhorn and others to that case as well. So it's not, the Eichhorn et al. Result is not tied to that convenient assumption. So what I'd like to do is to move on from that to a more, what I think is a more satisfactory approach, rather than just taking either intuition or just saying, well, it's all done with social standards, assumptions on social welfare functions. So I would argue that although intuition's nice, it's a bit arbitrary. And the reason we say it's a bit arbitrary is that you put the same concept, maybe in slightly different language, to two different people. They've got different intuitions about the same thing. And also, should we, in terms of judging tax progression, tie ourselves down immediately to the kind of standard social welfare function apparatus? I mean, social welfare analysis of all income distribution changes is interesting, but in terms of the practical matter of describing whether tax system 1 is more progressive than tax system 2, do we have to do it just in the language of social welfare? So, what we could do is to look more closely at the individual level of how the tax and benefit system changes people's incomes, and use that to make some judgment about individual progressivity and the way it's going to relate to overall tax progression. So we build this analysis on what pre- and post-intervention income looks like for each individual in the community. And we can then aggregate this to give us a measure of overall tax progressivity. Now, when I was thinking about the design of this talk, it suddenly occurred to me that there was a nice application here of a thing I did with my colleague Emmanuel Flacher 10 years ago, where we were looking at a related problem. Well, it's not really related, but it has the same shape, which was to say, well, if we were modeling income distributions, we just go to our statistician, our government statistician friends, and say, tell us what the income distribution is, or this particular concept of income. And we, for the purposes of economic analysis, we want to have a formal model of that, a Pareto distribution, a log normal, or something like that. What would constitute a good fit of the model to the data. So there's a parallel kind of problem, because what you're looking at here is you say, well, we've got the original income that just comes from the tax people. We're looking at this proposed description of what we see, a la Pareto, a la log normal, or some other fancy distribution. Are they close enough or not? So you're comparing two distributions, which is what we're doing here. So in order to compare distributions, we're doing sort of kind of Lorentz-type comparisons, but changing the rules a bit. So what we're introducing here is a kind of reference income distribution, which has been discussed in the literature over many years. A more recent one is by Almors and others in 2011. Stephen Jenkins, Michael Atkins did this back in 1989, introduced this idea of norm income. So it's not quite that, but it's a reference distribution. And we can use the concept of a reference distribution in our analysis here. In fact, without me being completely honest with you, we've already done this, because when we looked at ordinary Lorentz comparisons, a reference distribution is this notional idea of perfect equality. So you say, well, look, perfect equality isn't the point here. It's what the tax system does to the distribution. So what we need to do is to quantify the divergence of the actual distribution from the reference distribution, which is the idea that, say, Flachère and I pursued in that 2013 application, except that there the reference distribution was the particular model, and the actual, that was the original data, and we were looking at how far is the model away from the original data. So in this case, the actual distribution is, the distribution of income in people's pockets. And the reference distribution is the pre-tax distribution. So the connection between the two distributions is the tax system. Okay? So what we need, where we need to go on a bit further from ordinary Lorentz analysis, to say, well, we need to be able to compare pairs of distribution, or equivalently, just arranging the information in a slightly different way, looking at distributions of pairs. Pairs meaning doubles, not fruit. Okay, sorry. It sounded a bit odd to talk about distribution of pairs. But anyway, let me just introduce a little bit of notation, so that what we want to do is to connect the idea of the progressivity of the tax system with divergence of one distribution from another. And here are the concepts. So for each individual, we go through society, and so here we're not making any assumption about the way individuals are ordered, but we'll do that in just a moment. For each individual I, we've got pre-intervention income, YI, post-intervention income, XI, and we've got this pair, ZI, which is the tax treatment. Looked in terms of the outcome, it's the outcome of the tax treatment for individual I. And we can say, well, let's look at the distance between those two things. So it's an increasing function of the, that should be xi minus yi. I need to just change that increasing function of absolute value of xi minus yi, I should have written, to quantify this discrepancy between xi and yi. And for a complete description of all the information, we could look at this profile of tax treatments in the population. So with that bold Z, it's made up of the information about the pair that applies to individual 1, individual 2, up to individual n. And so now we've got two different ways of sort of looking at or visualizing the same information, the distribution of x and the distribution of y, or as the single profile Z. So how do we go about this? You might think, well, looking back at what I know about the literature on income distribution, we could look at maybe trying to find an ordering, like a Lorentz ordering or something like that, but now we apply it to these profiles. Or we could look at some kind of aggregation of the tax treatments of everybody to measure the divergence of post-intervention income from pre-intervention income. In fact, you can do both things at once. This is what we're going to do to save ourselves a little bit of time and a little bit of trauma as we go along. So what kind of principles should we apply? Well, we clearly want to introduce some kind of assumption like anonymity, which we do in regular inequality analysis. Switch around people's identities and nothing happens if you've defined income appropriately. We clearly want some concept of monotonicity, so if at some particular, if we're comparing two profiles and everything's the same except for person I, and we just sort of move xi and yi a bit further apart, then that's going to increase divergence. We'll get to the meaning of independence in just a moment. And we want some kind of assumption about what happens with regard to scale, so similar to the proportionality assumption in inequality comparisons. And by introducing specific axioms, well, we could have a nice and rather boring argument over a coffee or something about whether we've correctly captured those principles, but let's just see what we can do without too much work or too much imposing on your patience. And so by introducing axiomatization, what we find is that we can characterize an ordering over all possible profiles of pairs, these Z things. And it gives us a class of aggregation indices. Okay, so I've divided the axioms into two sets. The basic set cover sort of fairly simple things that we want to do. So in other words, if the distance, for any individual I, if the distance is greater between xi prime and yi prime, then we've got the divergence works like that. So anonymity, this is one we just need to focus on fairly carefully here. We're focusing on reordering the profiles. So we've not got an arbitrary reordering of X or an arbitrary reordering of Y, but just simply, we've got a whole bunch of files in the tax authorities' archives, and just renaming the files of individuals does nothing to our overall judgments on tax progression. We'll come back to that assumption here. So local discrepancy is just simply to say, well, what actually happens just if we were at a situation where there was a complete zero discrepancy between xi and y, and if we move those xi and yi's by a small amount, a mean preserving amount. And this shouldn't change our judgments on tax progression. So with independence, what we say is, well, let's suppose we took two profiles of treatments which we regard as equivalent. So Z is equivalent to Z prime. And if we find that for individual I, it appears that the Zi for that individual is the same under one profile Z or what the other profile is Z prime, then we could move that individual's pair around by this amount of zeta, as long as we don't move it around too much so that we upset the ordering in the distribution. And this would leave the judgments about Z and Z prime unchanged. So this is part of a very general class of results, that if you have assumptions like that, then what you can do is say, well, the ordering can be represented as just some function, phi I, for each of the tax treatments. Or we also need the assumption of continuity. It's probably a fairly straightforward, innocuous thing here. And in effect, what we get is an assessment of overall divergence, which based simply on making a judgment about each individual within the population, so that in effect what we can do is derive a kind of additive structure. In effect, what we're doing is going through the tax files, evaluating one income, or one pair of incomes, I should have said, which is probably a better way of doing it, one pair of incomes at a time. So that when we're evaluating person I's file there, we don't need to worry about all the other files and where the person is in the distribution. We can just do it in that way. Now, so that's the outcome of making the basic assumption that I mentioned. We've got two sorts of scale assumptions that we might want to make. And I'm going to, in each case, make the simplest assumption. One is that income scale doesn't matter for our judgments of comparing tax progression, in other words, divergence between Z and Z prime. So that if we scaled up all the X values and scaled up all the Y values by the same factor, I just said factor T, or scaled them down, if Z was equivalent to Z prime before the scaling, it's equivalent to Z prime after the scaling. It's similar to the kind of assumptions that underlie Lorentz orderings, this kind of thing. But the other assumption we could look at is say, well, supposing Z0 and Z0 prime are regarded as equivalent in terms of overall progressivity, overall divergence. And let's suppose that the distance, don't forget D is the distance between each person's, each person I's Xi and Yi. Let's suppose that's rescaled by a factor T, both for Z0 and Z0 prime, then we find that again, this leaves the distributional comparisons unaltered. So, bringing in the basic set of axioms, introduce that additive structure. And if we introduce income scale irrelevance, scale up or down all the incomes, we find that our overall measure of divergence must look something like this, where HI is some real value function. And if we also introduce discrepancy scale independence, so both scale axioms, then we find that overall we must have as our evaluation of divergence this sum of xi to the alpha, yi to the 1 minus alpha, and where alphas are constant. And there is a special case of what happens when alpha goes to 1. In effect, what we get is a class, once we've normalized this thing, we get a class of measures which I call J, and the thing at the top of the screen there is comes straight from the previous screen here, previous screen, and then you've got special cases where alpha is 0 and alpha is 1. And what we need to do, of course, just is interpret this parameter alpha. So we've got a whole class of divergence measures. And if alpha's positive, you're going to be sensitive to cases where post-intervention income is higher than pre-intervention income. So perhaps amongst the poor. And if alpha is negative, you're particularly sensitive when it's the other way around. So you're particularly looking at what happens to rich people's incomes. So you make a judgment about, say, well, when I aggregate up all this information in all those tax files, how should I do that? And you say, well, look, am I more bothered about what's happening with the tax and rich, bringing down the rich, or am I more bothered about in terms of bringing up the poor? That's a judgment that we can make. And there's a nice relationship between that and measures of inequality, as probably some of you already spotted, because if we took as our reference distribution original income, supposing it was perfect equality so that everyone got the mean of that, then what you would find is that your J index just becomes a generalized entropy index, because then you're saying, well, the reference distribution is not the actual pre-tax income distribution, it's this theoretical idea of equality, so that you've got, if you like, a connection between this fancier way of using a reference income distribution, which you want for tax progression, and the kind of thing that we ordinarily do in terms of inequality. Now, I think probably at this point we're going to feel urgently the need for coffee to refresh the brains. But what I'd like to do is just to point out in a very general way now what we can do in terms of making progressivity judgments. In effect, we need to do two things. One is to look at the changes in inequality, and the other is to see how much the post-intervention distribution diverges from the original distribution. They're not the same thing. So the inequality change is picking up overall welfare change, and then the divergence thing is picking up individual structure. So let's go back to that distribution that we, this is the same picture as we had before. And just to orientate yourself again, the red curve is original income, the broken dashed curve is final income after all the interventions have taken place. And in the UK context, let's look at how the different steps in going from original income to gross income, going from gross income to disposable income to post-tax income to final income, how that looks in terms of inequality comparisons and in terms of divergence. So if we were to look at inequality, what we've got along the horizontal axis here is alpha. So in terms of inequality, a low value of alpha says we're very sensitive to low incomes, high value of alpha very sensitive to high incomes. And the things that we can immediately see from here is that if we just run through the order of the schedules we've got there, at the top we've got original income, which, as you can see, our judgment on terms of inequality is going to depend very much whether we take a high value of alpha or a low value of alpha. At the bottom we've got final income, and interestingly, it turns out that with final income it really doesn't matter whether very sensitive to top incomes or bottom incomes, it's just the same. But let's just see the sort of the path that we get from the top distribution, original income, to the bottom distribution. In fact, that's more easily seen. You can see there's something a little bit odd there, which comes out more clearly if we were just to look at the differences in inequality as we go from step 1 to step 2 through to step 4. So look at this diagram here, which gives us this step-by-step approach to what's going on. So step 1 at the top is what we've got from just introducing cash benefits. So that yellow curve here has a big impact on changes in inequality. The second, going from top to bottom here, is what happens in the final step. So step 4, going from disposable income to final income, which again involves benefits, but these are non-cash benefits. Now, it is clear that whether your judgments involve high alpha to the right end of the diagram, or low alpha to the left-hand end of the diagram, either of those things is much, much greater than the third one down on the list, which is the impact of direct taxes, which again has an impact on inequality, but much smaller than either of the other two. And the thing which you may have already spotted, already knew from your own study of this area, is that when we look at indirect taxes, it shifts the wrong way. So that what happens is with direct taxes you get a reduction in inequality, with indirect taxes you actually get an increase in inequality. Now let's look at the related J index, the divergence here. If we focus on the red contour here, this again relates to alpha, whether we're sensitive, which parts of the distribution we're sensitive in here. So if we go from original income to final income, we get that red curve, which is saying let's look at the divergence of final income from original income. And clearly that divergence is much higher for high values of alpha. Now supposing we get the crazy politician who says, tell you what, here we are with this distribution of income, fundamentals of final income. Let's turn it all around and abolish this and go from final to original. You don't just do the negation of inequality differences here. What you get is a kind of antisymmetric relationship with that grey curve, like so. If we were to look at 4 individual stages of redistribution, so in each stage we start with income definition 1 and we move to income definition 2, that's the first step. Then the second step, we're going from 2 to 3, 3 to 4. You can see the impact in terms of divergence. We've got the same color coding here so that the blue curve and the yellow curve relate to. The blue curve is moving to the last stage, moving to final income from post-tax income through non-cash benefits. The yellow curve is the effect from just looking at the switch from original income to gross income. And you can see that the divergence is really big with those things there. So this is having a big impact. Your tax benefit functions, TOR, is doing a lot to the overall distribution, whereas the thing that comes through from taxes, either direct taxes, the light blue, or indirect taxes, is right down at the bottom. By definition, all of these things have to be greater or equal to 0. So we're not looking at the inequality differences here, but what's the change in the structure of the distribution, each time taking the previous definition of income as your reference distribution. What would happen if we took all the time the original distribution income as the reference point? Well, the top curve there is exactly what we had from the red line before, and all of the other curves are just taking into account each of those possible interventions using original income as the reference point. So in other words, it's similar to what we did there, but with this diagram where we're just looking at step by step, with each step using definition n as the reference distribution and n plus 1 as the actual distribution. Here we're just using definition number 1 all the time as the relevant concept. Finally, well, before I get on to the final, let me just mention that we ought to have discussed that there are really 2 dimensions of individual inequity. We focused entirely on vertical inequity, and some people have got a good foundation in, if you like, the philosophy of taxation. They say, well, look, you're not only interested in so-called vertical inequity, which ties in with our conventional concepts of inequality, but we should also be treating people who are similar in terms of their objective circumstances in similar ways. And what we've already mentioned in passing is that sometimes this appears to be violated, particularly where there are re-rankings. And there is this sub-literature on so-called horizontal inequity, which in the main focuses on how do we deal with these things when we've got re-rankings. Now, in case you're thinking, oh dear, we're not going to have another lot of very heavy maths, you don't need it. One thing that we should note is that there's not, looking at that literature, I think it's fair to say there's not a natural way of quantifying the degree of horizontal inequity. With vertical inequity, we start with the Lorentz curve and then the Gini coefficient from the Lorentz curve and then other concepts like generalized entropy indices. A number of very distinguished economists working in the field of taxation have tried to specify what the principles, distribution principles, ought to be applied to horizontal inequity. One thing that's interesting is that re-rankings, you'd never want to, by design, build those in, because this is a connection between our subject here and the whole literature on optimal taxation. If you've got re-rankings in your designed function at all, you actually violate the so-called incentive preservation property. And so it's going to just run counter to some of the basic assumptions you make in optimal tax theory. But I think for our purposes, all we need to do is to consider this as just another type of distributional comparison, the same way as we looked at divergence. And in fact, great relief here, you don't really need to do very much at all, because first of all, we did this stuff on anonymity. We said all you need to do is to say, well, if we just reorder the tax files, and instead of having under letter M, Miguel over there, we just put a different name on it, that shouldn't do anything, providing all the pairs X, I, Y, I stay the same. Now, if we were to extend this and we introduce a sort of super anonymity assumption so that we could just reorder arbitrarily the X's or reorder arbitrarily the Y's, it turns out that you're going to get the same type of measure that we called JI before, but we could interpret this slightly differently. Instead of divergence, we might want to call it movement that's induced by the tax system. So there's a kind of, to make a biblical reference here, the first shall be last and the last shall be first kind of thing, but use the same, you get the same class of indices. And it's very close to what you would do if you were using this sort of approach to measure mobility going from one period to another. Instead of going from one period to another, you're going from one notional income concept to another notional income concept. So let's draw together our thoughts on this. I think there is a very good case for considering both pragmatic approaches as well as formal analysis. And the reason is this, that pragmatic approaches are going to appeal to pragmatic people, and ultimately the people who design our taxes and the people who implement our taxes are going to be practical people. So if it doesn't have a pragmatic interpretation, you might as well forget it. Sometimes, though, there is a problem interpreting pragmatic approaches. If you just put on a diagram a Lorentz curve and say, oh, well, look at the Lorentz curve of tax payments in terms of ordered by income distribution, where you think, well, what exactly is going on there? Now, as we've seen, for example, with sort of heavy-duty results that have come out of Eichhorn and others, you can sometimes get some very straightforward and powerful results in terms of social welfare. But what we need, it seems to me, is that if we want an overall indication of progressivity of the tax system, we need an appropriate axiomatization to understand the way in which we can say that one tax system is more progressive than another along the lines that we mentioned there, taking into account, for example, such things as rescaling of incomes, that kind of thing. And when we come to appraise whether one tax system is more progressive than another, we want to take into account both the changes in inequality, which then have a welfare interpretation, and the movement within the system, whether it's just a simple increasing or decreasing of divergence, or whether it's actually taking into account the kind of reorderings that happen through horizontal inequity. And that's where I shall come to a conclusion. Thank you.
So thank you, Frank, for the illuminating presentation. Now we shall take some questions. We have two students there with micros. If you want to take some questions, please raise your hand and say your name, and please pose some questions, please, if you want to. You might either state it in Spanish, and we can translate, or either directly in English if you want to, okay? Because I don't know if... Some questions? No?
Where do I have my café? I think that's the main question.
Joshan, please. Joshan has questions.
I have a question about imputed rent, because I think...
Sorry, a question about?
Imputed rent.
Oh, yeah.
Which is important, I think, especially when we are moving toward inflation and so on. So that's one question that I have. A general question, another general question is, have you done some work about wealth inequality?
Answer to the second question is yes. Certainly have done that, not in terms of this kind of tax or progressivity analysis. Wealth inequality introduces its own nice difficulties. In fact, one of the standard questions I put to my students for discussion is, why is measuring wealth inequality fundamentally different from income inequality? And I think a major component of that answer, which would need to be reflected in something like this, is that whereas with income inequality, we can say, well, in theory you could have negative incomes, but they're exceptional. With wealth inequality, negative wealth values are everywhere to be found if you're looking at wealth being net worth. And so we need to look again at a subset of the kind of inequality indices we've got, a subset that can handle negative incomes. It can be done, but it reduces dramatically the number of indices that you can use. Your first question was about imputation of rents. And what was there? Was that the question that you had there in mind? Yeah. I find that an interesting question, because when you look at a system such as the UK, but I would think you would get a very similar answer if you put in stuff from Israel, for example, and looked at this, you would see that however you interpreted the numbers for the 5 different concepts of income, the big redistribution often comes from level 1 to level 2, a little bit different in Israel from the UK because of the role of the way pensions are accounted for there, and in 4 to 5. Well, in terms of number 1, the cash benefits, we can just look up the rules as to how that works out. But it's the final step from disposable income to final income that however you look at it, is going to have a big big impact on inequality, and there's a big divergence. And yet, we have to accept that a lot of that relies on imputation. I wasn't thinking so much of imputation of rents, but imputation of all sorts of other benefits that are implicit. For example, if you've got what Americans would call socialized medicine, like the National Health Service in the UK, which was just celebrated its 75th birthday, I think it was yesterday or something. You know, you can't ignore that, but how do you impute the benefits from it to individuals? And so I think one of the great exercises that is been done in part by some economists, but it ought to be done a lot more, is say, well, supposing we tear up the assumptions by the Statistics Office about how these benefits are allocated to individuals and introduce. I'll give you an example. We could all become very left-wing politicians and say, look, property taxes, or some of these taxes, for example, property taxes are very clearly, on people who have property, but also some of these other things that if we consider expenditure on the police, expenditure on national defense, well, these only benefit people who've got property to defend, So we shouldn't just assume that the benefits of the police are allocated to everybody. So it would be interesting to have a number of alternative extreme assumptions about how to allocate those non-cash benefits. I think the one thing that I would insist on is one doesn't just ignore it. You have to have, because clearly, whatever's going on there, it is going to have a big impact on the implied overall effect of the tax benefit system on redistribution.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Still have some minutes. It's 11 o'clock, but of course, Frank at the coffee. And, I don't know if there are more questions. We can still do some questions while having coffee and all of that, but we'll get back at 11:30. Okay.
Okay.
I don't know. Last chance. One more question. No.
They're exhausted.
They're thinking about the theorems and all of that. Okay. Thank you a lot. So now we'll go to the basement. We have a coffee break, and we will have the presentation of the Revista de Fomento Social. There will be a presentation there also, so there will be some the editors talking about the revista. Okay. Elena, I called you. Okay. Thank you a lot. So now we have a break.
Thank you.
It was very illuminating.
Thank you.
I have some questions. Now we can talk later.
Yeah.
I have one thing regarding. Did you study, for instance, how is the carbon tax in Europe?